right, we're going to do a tutorial on nesting. Nesting is the process that we use when we roll the quilt so that we have consistent spacing between all our rows throughout the whole quilt. So there are a few steps that we need to know to make nesting easier. And first is setting the spacing between the rows before you start quilting. Second, entering your quilt length using the quilt layout guide. And third, following all the nesting steps in order so that it's correct. I'm also going to show you what to do just in case you make a mistake. Okay, so let's get started. So on our tablet, we're going to, in our quilt, we're going to pick our quilt area. Then go to the bottom right. Okay, and then we need to pick a design, and we want something that is more like a border to border or a little more rectangular so that we don't have to crop on this one. Okay, so first we're going to come in to our repeat, go down to horizontal and just repeat across. Now depending on the density I want that. If I want it smaller, I would add more past my orange box. Or if I want it larger, I wouldn't fill the orange box all the way. So let's do one more. And then we're going to do a scale. So scale is the fourth one down. And we're going to do a smart scale. And then we have to go to move, which is the second one down. And then we're going to use this one to lock that pattern to the top. So it just brings the pattern to the top of your pattern box. Okay, so the first step is we need to set that spacing between the rows. So right now, if I bring in a second row, even though I can't quilt it, you can see here we have a line going all the way across that is very noticeable. So it needs to have a negative spacing. So we have our vertical spacing and horizontal spacing, so spacing comes across here. We want to change that vertical spacing. So we're going to bring it up until that looks really nice and consistent. We can't quilt both of them because I'm out of my quilt area, so I'm going to take off that second one. So that's our first step. Second is if you've measured your quilt, then you can come down into our quilt layout guide. And my length on this quilt was just over 50 inches. So I'm going to just put 50.5. And doing this pass, the number of passes is 5.8. So I'm going to change that, and I'm just going to make it 6 passes. It's going to barely change it out of proportions, made it slightly smaller, but it kept my same spacing. It still remembers that spacing. So now I'm not going to have to crop at the top or the bottom, and you can kind of look. This is how many rows we're going to have, the 6 rows. So this is my quilt right there. We just finished quilting out this row. Now we can do the nesting procedure. So what we're going to do is going to go on our tablet. There's these little hearts on the bottom right corner, and that is our nesting icon. So then on the screen, you just have to follow each step. It says select and mark your nesting point. So I choose somewhere in the bottom middle of my quilt. And the reason I do the middle now is because there's not as much movement on the quilt here in the middle. So it just makes it more accurate. Put my needle down, and that's my nesting point. Now if this pattern, instead of being a rectangular pattern, was a pattern that sits inside, so nests inside of each other, I would choose the upper portion of that area. So I wouldn't choose the lowest point, because when I roll, I could accidentally roll too far. So this way, if you're at the upper edge of the bottom row, then you're good for your nesting point. Okay, and then it says roll the quilt. So you'll only roll the quilt once it says roll the quilt. So I'm going to quickly do that. Take my clamps off and This is when you're going to make sure that your fabric is tensioned correctly. You're also going to check if your take-up bar can move up and down. You're going to check, can you get your finger under there? If not, then it's time to raise that up a little bit. Again, check your tension on your quilt. Fix your batting. Make sure that there's no wrinkles in it. And then we're done. We've rolled the quilt, so we'll do our check mark. It says move to your nesting point. Well, since my needle's down, I'm already there. I just make sure that it's not pulling on the fabric, that it's nice and flat. And then I say, okay, I'm at my nesting point. Now, if you look at the screen, you have both your old row that we quilted and the new row. And you can see that they are nesting really nice. We don't have that empty space between the two rows. So the nice thing is, since we've done that, I can just click check. But if I had forgotten to do that, I'm going to pull up my needle. If I'd forgotten to do that, I can push this little move icon. And here, if it looked like that, then all I have to do is push the move icon and then just push the machine further back until that spacing looks nice. And then I would go in and fix that in Edit and make sure I have set the spacing like we talked about earlier. Then we say check mark. Okay, so now you would go and you would baste down your edges along here. Another thing, so you baste down your edges, and then after you do that, you're going to add a clamp. So let me quickly baste down this side so I can show you. Lots of thread underneath there. Okay, so on patterns that need to be very accurate, you can check to make sure that your positioning on the quilt is the same as on the tablet. So if you come over here and let's find a certain point. So right here, you can see that the, which one can you see easier? Right here. Okay, so I'm going to just move my needle to that point on my design. And now up on the tablet, we can zoom in. Oops, zoom into our needle. Okay, so you can see here that I'm not quite on that point. So once I get my clamp on there, I just moved my crosshairs to that point, and now when I put my clamp on, I'm going to make sure that I'm just directly above that point with my needle. So I've made sure that this is in the same position. So if we were doing a pattern like diagonal plaid or clamshells or anything like that, we can make sure that we're lined up correctly so that it doesn't have weird spacing on either side. And then I can do the clamp on this side. And then we'll do the same thing over here. So we'll come over, find a specific point. There's a little point here on this swirl. We're going to zoom in, zoom out, zoom back in. And you can see, since this was quilted first, it's quite a bit different because of quilt take up. So when I go to put on my clamp, this one I'm going to have to give it just a little bit snugger tug. And now I'm right on that tip of that little swirl right here. And then I can go ahead and baste this side. Since I've already basted here, that's why I'm okay putting the clamp down. Okay, now we'll quilt this row out, and then I can show you some other things after it's done. Okay, our second row just finished, and we're going to nest again, but this time I'm going to make a mistake on purpose. So now we first start with select and mark our nesting point, and then I'm gonna roll the quilt, but I didn't do my check mark, so I'm gonna show you what to do in case that happens to you. I'm gonna roll the quilt. And then when I come back, I'm like, oh, I forgot to put my check mark, and so it doesn't say roll the quilt. So here, I would just push the X right here. And right now, the position of the pattern on your tablet is where your quilt was. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up my needle, and I'm going to find a point on the tablet. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, get on a point on the tablet, go into nesting, and select my nesting point. Now it says roll the quilt, so we're going to just push our machine back and find that same little hook just right directly above it. So right there on the quilt. So we're in the same position. Let me come back out. So on here, we're not paying attention to the tablet now, just the quilt. Now we're on that exact little point, and we're going to say, okay, I've rolled the quilt. It says move your machine to your nesting point. I'm there, and since I've already set the spacing, we're done, and we can say check. So a lot of people, if you have rolled your quilt and you forget that you have to finish your nesting, and then you bring up your needle and you baste the sides of your quilt, then all you need to do is just do the X at the bottom of the tablet, and then just do what I did. Find that point below on the tablet, and then do your nesting procedure. It says roll the quilt, and then just move it up to another point that's on the quilt. So you're using that as your reference. Okay, now we'll just go ahead. I'll baste, quilt one more row, and then just show you how to do it when everything goes the way it's supposed to. All right, third row is finished. I just want to show you how quickly it can be if you just follow all the steps and nest like normal. So we're going to pick our nesting point and put our needle down. Check mark. Roll the quilt. Fix my batting. Check my tension. Still have enough space there. Okay, I've rolled the quilt. I'm at my nesting point. Check mark. There's both my designs, and nesting is complete. I really appreciate you guys watching. Hopefully you've been able to learn, and it'll help you with your nesting and to keep your spacing correct. And let me tell you, our word of the day is going to be Butler. Thanks for joining. Please subscribe.